it did. I know, we were like, this is smooth, no problem. So
Okay.
it is a pleasure to be with you all here today. My name is Nicole Farkouh. I'm Smith class of 98. I had the privilege of living in Morrow for a couple years. I was in Morris, and then I also was the HR in Ziskin my senior year. And I actually just got to go back to my 20th reunion, which was amazing and crazy. I got to take my daughter, who was just turning 8, and she loved it, and I actually had so much more fun than I thought I was going to. So it was really special, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today to be talking about this exciting topic of Strategy 2.0. So as Lindsay said, please go ahead and let's see, and I'll share my screen and get going with that. And share there, and here we go. So I'm hoping that you leave today with some concrete learning about what Strategy 2.0 is. It's a much bigger topic than we can actually completely cover in the 50 minutes that we have left, but this is really a high-level introduction to what it is and some concrete next steps for how you can go more deeply into it. So ask clarifying questions or content questions, just type them into the chat function as we go through. And if there are no, and then Lindsay will bring the clarifying questions to my attention and we'll address those. And then the content questions we're going to save to the end of the time. So to give you an overview of kind of where we're going, if I can get the screen to move, this is for those of you that like to have kind of a big picture overview of where we're going and what we're going to be up to. This is the flow, and these are the different questions that we're going to be answering as we go through our time together. And at the bottom of the screen are the things that I hope that you are able to walk away from this with. So I also want to let you know that we're going to be making the webinar available to you after. So if there's a recording happening, and if for some reason it doesn't, if you miss anything, you can catch up on it later. All right, so move to the next slide. So I wanted to just also share with you, let's see, because you all did not hear my introduction, I will just say that I have a consulting practice. I do facilitation, consulting, organizational development, and I work with leaders and teams so that they work better together and have more fun at work so that they can have greater impact and performance. And so I have a holistic consulting practice, and I weave a lot of different things together. And underneath everything that I do is an attention to culture and a commitment to equity on all the various levels that is an issue in our lives right now. And so this slide is a representation of the concepts and big ideas that have woven together to lead me to this Strategy 2.0, which I'm going to explain to you what that is. We're going to talk about the Cynefin decision-making framework, which is a really I won't go into that now because I'm going to spend a little time on that later, but I wanted to just lift up also these notions of the growth mindset, which comes from Carol Dweck at Stanford. Also, the authors Chip and Dan Heath, who have the book called Switch, which is about how to create change and change management and what is necessary for that. Both of those are from folks out of Stanford, and they have had significant influence in my thinking about how to work with groups and organizations. And also adaptive leadership comes from Ronald Heifetz, and he's out of Harvard. And so actually I was working at Google a few years back, and one of the things that was really hot with their executive education was the notion of adaptive leadership, and also some of the other things that I have been influenced by was definitely the seeds for some of these were planted at the time that I was at Google. So in case you want to dig deeper with any of this stuff, you can look into some of this. And I'd like you to ask, Lindsay, if you go ahead and launch the first poll. As we move on to the next slide, I'd like to ask you to participate in a poll so that it can be as interactive as possible. And you can just go ahead and click on your answer. And the question is, in the past 6 months, to what extent have you felt overwhelmed with the decision that you're trying to make? And that last part actually didn't get incorporated into the question, but if you could add in your thinking as you answer this question, with the strategic decision that that you have had to make for your organization, to what extent have you felt overwhelmed in the past 6 to 12 months? So you can go ahead and click on that, and then, and it also looks like there's a typo. The last option should be extremely. So Lindsay, I'm not sure if something is cutting off in the poll, but maybe you could check that out for later. Okay, and so if folks have been responding to that, then we can pull it up. I'm not actually seeing the results, so Lindsay, if you want to show us that when it's ready, that'd be great. And in the meantime, this next slide is actually, I did some data analysis and some research on the folks who I have been working with. And I've had the privilege of working for over 15 years with a variety of organizations in the US, out of the country, different parts of the country. And one of the things that I have really seen over this time is that the decisions and the pace of change that people are dealing with is getting the pace of change that people are dealing with is more complex, and the decisions are constantly more nuanced, and they seem to be getting more challenging, and they seem to be causing more tension for folks as over time. And so, and actually I'm not seeing my notes because the poll, oh, that's weird. The poll is showing up on my screen too. Okay, there, now it's gone. So so I did some data collection with the folks who I have worked with to try to understand what my impact was with them. And what I essentially want to call your attention to is many people are experiencing increased challenges in making decisions because of the pace of the world and how fast things are moving, and it's like the ground that we're on is constantly shifting. Okay, great. And here are the results from the poll, and so that's those really line up well with what we're experiencing too. That 56% of folks are experiencing significant overwhelm when they're trying to make a strategic organizational decision, and an additional 11% are extremely experiencing that. So those findings align. This findings, at least of this group, align with my experience with the clients that I've worked with as well. And so really what I believe is the essence of Strategy 2.0 is supporting with this issue of being able to make decisions with an experience of reduced overwhelm and increased clarity, and also being able to find a path forward in places where people are already stuck. So we are now going to move on at lightning speed to talking about why we need Strategy 2.0. And it was really great to have you do the poll, because it's powerful to anchor in your experience that what I'm talking about is actually going to likely be relevant for a lot of you as well. So I believe that culturally we're at a very exciting and challenging and complex time. And actually, as we do this, let's do the next poll. Go ahead. You can go ahead and launch the next poll, which is asking about the Cynefin framework and how familiar you are with it. And that will give me insight as to how much we should be, how in depth I'm going to go with it. So while you're filling that out, I'm going to say that I feel like we are at a very exciting cultural time, and it's increasingly complex. And I think that part of what is exciting for me about it is that we are breaking out of old hierarchical models of being and relating to each other. And we're seeing that in organizations, we're seeing that in communities, we're seeing that, I think, as a society with our broader questions around equity. And if you really take a giant 10,000 foot step back, if you think about the way that society is shifting over this broader arc of time, though we are not where we want to be with it in the majority of cases when we think about race and when we think about gender and when we think about class, we are still seeing that there is increasing voice and increasing recognition of the need for voice of everybody. And so those older hierarchical models are really breaking down. And part of what is exciting about that is also really challenging about that, because because that creates the space in which the landscape is constantly changing. And so part of what I'm offering for you today is one way to think about and make sense of all this. So Lindsay, do you have the results of the Cynefin framework as I move on to the next slide? Okay, excellent. I was the one who put very familiar answer. So I'm going to assume that the majority of you have never heard of it, and I'm going to talk through it with you as we go. Great. Thank you. So this, as you can see, is it's actually a five quadrant, a 4-quadrant with a center model. And the purpose of this framework is to help you think about how to assess the state of the world that you're in when you need to be making a decision. And so in the bottom right corner, and I'm just going to go through these each briefly, and then we'll go more in depth. Actually, the bottom right corner is the obvious quadrant. And so in this quadrant, cause and effect is apparent. And so the recommended way of behaving when you're a decision maker in this is to sense, to categorize, and then to respond. And so you sense what's going on around you. You say, oh, well, based on the input that I have, I know that this is what I should do in this circumstance, and I respond. And the pitfall of this category is that it may be oversimplified. You may think that because you've had success, you may be like, okay, this is easy, and you might become complacent. And so to avoid this pitfall, decision makers need to be very intentional about their communication and have good communication channels in place. This is also the domain of sort of known knowns, and it's also a domain of best practices. And so this is the space where you're like, okay, it's kind of obvious. This is what you do in this situation. This is the best way to respond, and go forward with that. So then we move up into the upper left quadrant, which is the the upper right quadrant, which is the complicated quadrant. And so in this quadrant, there is a relationship between cause and effect that you can investigate, but it's not obvious. There may be several correct solutions, there may be trade-offs that you have to weigh, and typically to get to the clear relationship to get to the place where you make a decision about how you're going to move forward to create the effect that you want, you may need expertise and you may need analysis. And so the recommended behavioral pathway for this is someone senses, the leader, who the decision maker senses, they analyze, and then they respond accordingly. And this is really the domain of experts. So it may be that the decision maker themselves is doing the sensing and the analyzing and responding, or it may be that the experts are brought in to do the sensing and the analyzing, and then based on recommendations, the leader then makes a response and makes a decision accordingly. So as I said, this is the domain of experts, and one of the pitfalls is that leaders might rely too heavily on experts and they might miss creative alternatives. And this is the space of not best practice, but good practice. And it's the space of known unknowns. So you know what you don't know, which is an important thing to be able to do. So this is the state of the world where we have been for a long period of time. Or whether we've actually been there or not, we have believed that this is sort of the state of the world, where we can find we can see the relationship or find the relationship between cause and effect. If we do enough analysis, we can make a good decision going forward. And so in that world, the sort of traditional approach to strategic planning worked. And so this is an example. This is just an example of a visual way of depicting what a traditional strategic planning process might look like. And I call that strategy 1.0. And so strategy 1.0 is this linear process that works well to manage complicated scenarios. So that upper right quadrant. Part of what happens in strategy 1.0 is that it assumes stability. It establishes a direction and strategies to reach those outcomes that you want to accomplish. And it has a time frame that is kind of long, like 3 to 5, sometimes even 10 years. And so people invest a lot of money in understanding, they sense, and then they analyze, and then they make their decisions and they respond, and then they project and they go forward. So that is how strategic planning has typically been done. And we're now going to go back to the Cynefin framework and talk about the complex, which is where I believe, and what my clients are, feeding back to me about where in the world we are now, the state of the world that we're in. And so in the complex quadrant, we're now in the space of unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know. And the relationship between cause and effect is actually not linear, or it actually is something that you might not be able to figure out at all. But if you can figure it out, it's usually in hindsight. And so part of the pitfall with this is that if you're in a complex state of the world, thinking that if you find cause and effect, you can then apply that information in the next scenario where the circumstances look similar. In a complex state of the world, that doesn't apply anymore. So what worked in the past, based on, and what you can figure out based on analysis, no longer actually works in this state of the world. And so in the complex space of the world, there's no longer this sensing and analyzing and then responding, but instead the pathway to action, to decision making, is actually to probe and to sense and then to respond. And so it's really the space of emergent practice, and it's a space of experimentation. And so it's all about, okay, we think if we do this, like that's where we want to go, and we think if we do this, it's going to get us there, but we're going to actually wait and see if, when we get a little feedback, to see if that's moving us in the direction that we want. And we might be doing a couple of different experiments all at the same time to figure out, how do we go toward this? We have these 3 options. Which one of these is going to get us there the best? We start a little bit with all of them and then say, okay, this one actually looks like it's going in the best direction, and we go there. So there's much less linearity in this space, and determining strategies as sort of the committing to strategies is not actually an effective way of moving forward in this space. And so this is really asking us to have a complete mind shift in our way of thinking and being around decision making. And so this is pretty deep. And it's not something that you're going to wrap your head around entirely today. But again, this is intended to be high level. And I also meant to mention in the beginning that one of the analogies that I like to use often when I'm doing this presentation or other trainings is, this is sort of an experience of a fire hose. So don't try to drink everything that is coming at you right now. Like, just let the water, drink what you can, let what you can come in, and like let the rest of it just kind of wash past you. So, or maybe a waterfall is a more relaxing image than a fire hose. So, imagine standing under a waterfall. You're not going to be able to drink all that water. Just take a little bit of it in and like let it wash over you. And then there'll be time afterwards to kind of process and integrate this more. So I'll just briefly touch on the last 2 elements of the model, which is chaotic and disorder. We won't spend much time there but I just want you to not have cognitive dissonance that I didn't talk about it. So in the chaotic space, this is not just unknown unknowns, but it's actually unknowable unknowns. And this is a space where you're in, it's typically a crisis scenario when you're in the chaotic space. And really what is asked of leaders in that moment is to act, to bring stability, then to sense, and then to respond. So when you think of natural disasters, like, people just need to get into action. They do what they can, and then they kind of figure it out. And theoretically, you want to be acting and sensing and responding to get people back to a place, get the situation back to a place of either complexity or complication, even being in the obvious quadrant, depending on how it all flows out. And then the disorder is really just a space where sometimes there are situations where you're not actually sure what quadrant you're in. And so that's just an invitation to get a little more information so that you can locate yourself and then make decisions accordingly. So again, I just went through, I know that's like a very intricate framework. I threw a lot of water came down the waterfall at you with that, and feel free to chat some questions into the chat window, but we're going to just keep going through, and we'll have time at the end to talk about it more. So so as I showed you before, sort of the linear arrows of strategy 1.0, this is a couple of ideas of what strategy 2.0 can look like. And so strategy 2.0 is not intended to be about linearity, and it's not intended to be about deciding on the pathway that you're going to use to get somewhere. Strategy 2.0 is actually much more about getting clear on your identity as an organization and the end goal of where you're trying to go, and working to create the culture and the climate within your organization, your team, your group, to be able to move toward that in a way that allows for iteration and experimentation, knowing that the land on which you're standing is constantly shifting, and that the pathway forward is going to be through sensing and through probing, not necessarily through analysis. ultimately, this strategy works, much better. This approach to strategy works much better in complex contexts, and it supports really dynamic decision making. It works really well with emergence, and it can enhance the core functions and the identity and the culture of the organization because it's really grounded in identity. And so again, these are just two examples of the way that an organization might document their strategy, and it can look many, 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 many different ways. But I wanted to just give you a visual so that you would be able to have some way of juxtaposing in your mind what those two things look like, how the two, strategy 1.0 and 2.0, and how they're different. All right, so here we go into the meat. What is a strategic framework and what is strategy 2.0? So I use strategy 2.0 to refer to a strategic framework. So in my mind, those two things are synonymous. And this is my definition of what a strategic framework is. So this is the heart of strategy 2.0, and I'm going to read it just because I know there's some folks that are on the phone. So it's a framework that sets a strategic direction for a change effort. It shapes the collective identity of those working to make that change and provides a map to guide decision-making and problem-solving pertinent to these efforts. And one of the things that, part of the reason I use the language about change efforts is because essentially anytime you are doing something to create something, you are actually making change. And so one of the big ideas I've been kind of playing with is how people talk about change management as like a separate discipline, and there are change management processes. But in this new state of the world that I've been sort of talking about and sharing with you, the way I think about it is that we are in this constant state of change, and that is part of the reason we're in this complex space is because of this constant change. And so part of what we're being called to do as leaders in organizations and people working to make change is to actually not just think of change as a discrete process that you need to step into, but it's actually learning about what is necessary to support and sustain change and incorporating that into our ways of being and operating on a regular basis going forward. So the component so there are some benefits to creating the framework, and I'm going to get more detailed with actually what I define as the components of the framework. But I want to just share with you as we go into that there are some really amazing benefits that can result for organizations that are going through the process of developing a strategic framework, and then not just developing it, but it's actually holding the strategic framework and integrating it into your way of functioning as an organization. So the process itself can be incredibly supportive and inspiring for people that are involved. It can really support engagement and motivation. It also lays a really great foundation for any work you're doing around communications, for any work you're doing around evaluation. And it really can help organizations shift from being action-oriented to actually impact-oriented. And so that's something that I'm not going to go into too much here, but that's one of my favorite things to talk about is because I work with a lot of nonprofit organizations and government agencies, as well as other organizations. But that's sort of the focus, has been the focus of my work. And there's a big difference between what you're doing and the impact you're trying to have. And there's been a real evolution of the nonprofit sector moving beyond what are the things that we're doing to actually what is the change that we're making. And the notion of the mission statement itself actually is a documentation of what you as an organization do. But in order to really create impact, there is a profound shift in orientation that is required for organizations to make to what is the change that we're working toward. And that's a conversation that we can have at another time. If you're interested to talk about that, let me know and we'll be happy to go into it. But I'm not going to go into it now too much. But this process of going through a strategic framework development and then holding it in your organization can really support that shift in thinking from what are we doing to actually what are we creating? What is the change that we're working in service of? All right, so here are the components, drum roll please, of what is included in a strategic framework. And so what you'll notice is that some of them are shaded in darker gray, and those are the ones that I believe are sort of non-negotiable, and the others are optional elements that, depending on where your organization or your team are, what needs you have, you can do, you can work with any of these. And you can incorporate them into the process. And you might be trading off time versus, like the depth of, essentially it's always a trade-off around time. How much time and bandwidth do you have to have these conversations? Because the more you incorporate into the process, the richer it can be, but also the more time it is required. So I'm actually going to, Lindsay, ask you if you could launch the next poll, which is to just ask you all to comment on which of the following structures you have in your organization. So do you have, and you can check all of the above that you have. So strategic plan, theory of change, mission statement, vision statement, values and or principles that are articulated, and then a purpose statement. And I'm not gonna submit mine, it's making me do this. Okay, I have a theory of change for myself. And the vision statement, values. Okay, great. So I'm gonna include my own answers and then go forward with that. And Lindsay, when those are done, you can just pop that up on the screen. And Ada, I see your interest in talking about that more, so we'll definitely talk offline about how to support organizations that are shifting to making change as opposed to just being in action, which is one of my favorite topics. Okay, so while those poll results are coming in, I'm actually going to move now. And here's like another waterfall, where the next 3 slides are very much standing under the waterfall trying to drink slides. So we're gonna go through this because I want, and my intention in offering this with a lot of detail is because I want you to at least walk away from this webinar with, like, if you were gonna, with a very high level manual of, if you wanted to go off and do this in your team and organization, how would I start? And so these next 3 slides are really about, like, okay, what are the conversations we need to have and how do we do that? We're going to go through it fairly in depth because it's meaty and it's a lot of information. All right, and so we are seeing the results of the poll. Thank you so much for putting that up, Lindsay. Everybody has a mission statement. Well, not everybody, but most everybody has a mission statement, because the code, the nonprofit code actually requires that, and like it's just a really standard practice in business. And again, the mission statement focuses on what we do, and it's really encouraging to see how many folks actually have. Oh no, I was encouraged for a moment, because I was seeing lots of theories of changes and purpose statements. The values and principles is actually very encouraging to see that many folks have that, and the purpose statement and the theory of change are really powerful structures that I've actually incorporated into the strategic framework, as you'll see as we go through. So this is great. Again, the results that you are sharing really mirror my experience working with clients. So you'll see the columns that go across. Each column is talking about one of the components of the framework, and then each row, the 4 rows are the definitions, the key question that you're answering through the discussion and then articulation of that component. And then there's an example of what that language might look like. And then I've also included a high priority voices, which is really about who are the people in the organization that want to be contributing to this conversation. And so, as I've mentioned, this slide is created with the idea of thinking about nonprofit organizations. And so, and typically smaller organizations that are, have like 50 or, under 30, around that size staff, and usually boards of like 20 or less. So this can all be modified for much larger organizations, but that is typically the group size that I've been working with. So the purpose of the purpose statement, well, and again, the lightly shaded gray ones are more optional elements, and then the darker shaded ones are things that are, in my opinion, non-negotiable to include. And as you'll notice, the non-negotiable ones are ones that are more frequently, that more folks have to, that when we just responded to the poll, more folks already have those darker gray items because they're more common in the field of organizational development and in the world. Oh, let's see. Oh, you see the desktop background. That is interesting. I didn't know that. Let me try this. I can totally make it larger. How is that? Hopefully that's better. Yay. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, I thought it was just showing you that one particular thing. I didn't get it. All right, good. Feedback is so valuable. So, as you can see, the purpose, and again, this is really important for clarifying questions. So if you have any other clarifying questions as you're looking at these slides, let me know. Chat it into the box. I'm not going to go through every cell, but I do want to just say that the purpose is really a beautiful thing to spend time orienting folks around and talking about. And essentially the way that you go about developing a strategic framework is you say, let's have a conversation about our purpose. And you have a conversation about that, and you come up with some language, and you draft it, and then you put it down. And then you do that for each of the different components, and then you fit them together. And so really what the purpose is getting at is like, what are you trying to create? What is it that you're trying to create in the world? Why does your organization exist? And like, in some ways, what would be the state of the world if you didn't exist? And there's really a relationship between the purpose and the issue statement, and we'll come to that on the next slide. The vision is really a very aspirational statement. As I mentioned, the mission is really about what you're doing to achieve your purpose. And so if you're clear, so one of the things that can be so tricky about missions is people have missions, but they don't necessarily articulate their purpose. So they're articulating all the things they're doing, but they haven't necessarily grounded it in what the purpose is of why they're doing that action. And it may sound like it's a nuance, but it's actually really profound to be able to articulate that, because it can be very grounding and orienting to groups of people as they're working together to try to accomplish something. So the vision is intended, like, really lives in the heart. The mission, I tend to think, like, lives in the body. So the mission is really where the body is like doing into the action. And then the vision is really is intended to kind of get to the heart. And the vision always is aspirational, and that's okay for it to be aspirational. The values also, and the core ideals also live in the heart. And I think what's really powerful about the values and the core ideals is that they offer a way to express yourself into the world, but also really powerful ways to create the culture that you want in the organization. And so values are something that can be used externally and internally. And thinking through, like, what you want, really what you're willing to go to the mat for and fight for, is one of the ways to get down to your values. And the last thing I'll say about values is that it's very important, in my opinion, to not just have words like possibility, dignity, and interdependence, but to actually define what that means, because going through the process of defining it is really an important conversation. And then making sure that people are using them in the same way is crucial. And it is actually it's very common, much more common than you would imagine, to say we all believe in integrity, but not actually all have the same meaning, the same definition of what integrity means. So I am seeing a question about sharing this afterwards. Yes, Abby, the webinar will be available for folks afterward, and I'm happy to make the deck available to Lindsay if that is a possibility. You know the tech end on that, so maybe you can chat in the window, but I'm happy to make it available if there's a mechanism for doing that. Okay, great. Absolutely. So we will, yes. All right, so moving on. So as I mentioned before, the problem statement goes really nicely with the purpose. And so the problem statement is like, what is the issue or the problem that we seek to address? And so you can often have one or the other of those, or you can choose to have both, but I would always recommend at least one articulation of either the purpose or the problem statement or issue statement, because that really is very orienting. And then again, you'll notice that on this slide, we've incorporated maybe community members or other partners into some of the conversations, whereas on the previous slide, it was mostly board and staff. So the desired change is really the outcomes. And when you are, so if you're in a for-profit, your outcome typically is profit. And if you're in a nonprofit or a social profit organization, then it's really important to articulate what it is that you are working to create. And that's where this desired change comes in. So the jargon for it is outcomes. And it's really about defining what the state of the world will be when you've been successful. And you can really add gradations to that, because the desired change can be very aspirational, but it also is important for it to be concrete enough that people can see progress and feel that they've made it, that they're, figure out ways to feel like they're actually pushing the needle, and that the passion and energy and life force that they're putting into this work is making a difference. And so adding immediate, short-term, mid-term, and long-term outcomes can be really important, and all that can be incorporated into the strategic framework. And then the strategies is the overarching approaches that we want to use to make the change. And so, as I said before, strategies in this style of in the strategic framework world are not about exactly saying this is the thing that we're going to do, but it's like these are the ways of being, and these are the approaches that we're going to incorporate as we figure out how we can best move forward to get to this change. All right, and I'm going to go on to the next slide. Time already is going so fast. And then the last slide is, the last three are really articulating the priority population that you want to serve, articulating your assumptions and the things that you really hold to be truth and reality. It's like articulating your reality. In many ways, it's defining the water in which you swim, or the air in which you breathe. And that can be really tricky, but it can be really powerful to do that. And then the last bucket is evidence, and evidence is, really just tying it to an evidence base, because that's so often really important for funders, and also for you to know that whether that evidence base is published evidence or it's your own experiential evidence experience and evidence that you have used to make change in the past, and so that you can document and have a rationale for why you're choosing to do the things that you're doing, and why those are all important. And having that articulated can put you in a really strong position for communications about the work and the impact that you're having. I also want to just touch on that when I mention partners in the high priority voices to have in these conversations, one of the things that can be really strategic to do is to incorporate potential funders or current funders or potential new board members that you want to get involved into these conversations, because they can get super excited and committed to the organization by participating in these conversations. And you can get a lot of really good feedback. And also, when it comes to assumptions, having external, actually, I should add something to this with a high priority voices, because it's actually really critical to have external perspective on what your assumptions are, because it's defining the water that you're swimming in or the air that you're breathing. It's much harder to actually see it yourself. All right, so I'm going to pause the waterfall for a minute, and I'm going to ask you just to take 30 seconds to reflect and type into the chat, what are some ways in which you see a strategic framework being useful for you? And I'm not going to really read through all of them right now, but I do want to give you a moment to just pause and think about how a strategic framework would be supportive for you before we move on to the next section. I'm going to take a deep breath, and I'm going to have a sip of water to make myself be quiet while you type. We call it think time in education. Okay, great. So I'm seeing some answers come in, so I'm going to continue talking. So the next piece that we're going to go through is how to create and to use one. And so I have a 5-step process that I use with organizations. And the truth is that based on the time constraints that we have today, we're not going to be able to go through this entire process today in any depth. But I want to just, again, give you a real overview and also connect it into implementation. Because one of the things that that I feel really sad about and see over and over again in organizations and hear about is the way that organizations invest a lot of time and money in coming up with a strategy or strategic plan that then ends up going and sitting on the shelf and And so I think that that's the last thing that I want, is for people who are already stretched and working hard and doing super important work, and or just, you know, working in organizations that are very fast paced and all of that, to do something that isn't meaningful and doesn't actually have impact and bearing on the way that they work and create the potential for improvement in that. And so implementation is always on my mind. And so I just want to talk briefly about that today, so that it can also be in your mind as you think about this, because it's not just about having the conversations and creating the framework. It's actually about integrating it ultimately into the way that you go about being in the world. So, so these 5 phases are: first, you're kind of framing it, and you're going to figure out who you're going to have in the conversations, and just plan the logistics out. You're going to decide which conversations, which components you're going to incorporate. You know, the possibility for creating a strategic framework is something that I've done in as little as a day and as much as 6 months. It really just depends on what your organization has the bandwidth to do and how you can hold it and what the momentum is that you can sustain around it. And so the longer and more deeply you can do it, the more power it has for your organization. And doing it in a day in a retreat and kind of knocking it out and coming up with something can also be really powerful. It's just 2 totally different approaches. And it always ends up coming down to like time, resources, bandwidth for making it happen. So then the next phase, once you've mapped it all out, figured out how you're going to do it, is you just jump in and you have these really exciting, juicy conversations, and you come up with draft language for them. Then you move on to the 3rd step, where you reflect and you kind of pull it all together, and you take a step back and you're like, okay, so how does this land for us? How does this feel? And you share it with your trusted advisors, and you might, depending on your organization, you might be sharing it with investors, you might be sharing it with the community that you're serving, and you just get feedback on it, and then you kind of finalize it, and then you say, okay, this is our working version going forward for now. And the idea, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the idea with a strategic framework, when you really do this identity work, is that it's not something that only lasts for 3 to 5 years. Really, this is like an identity that can shift and evolve over time, but for the most part, it's like the heart of the organization, and that isn't going to change as nearly as quickly as a traditional strategic plan was. So this is something that you revisit and you keep alive, and you might be tweaking, but you actually, ideally, it's an enduring structure that you use for a really long time. So then you get into the 4th phase, where you actually turn this into something that allows you to make decisions. And so this is the part where I know that you're going to want more information about this, and there just isn't the time for me to share it with you, but I'm happy to talk with you about it more individually at some point in the future. But you really want to, this is the way of thinking about how to make decisions different than we're committing to this pathway and this strategy and executing it. But it's this new way of being and orienting to this constantly shifting landscape that you have to work in, and figuring out what are the tensions and the polarities that we need to be constantly thinking about every time we make a decision. And so you really want to get clear on what those polarities and criteria are, and then through articulating that, you almost define the space in which you are going to be making your decisions. And then when the decisions come up to be made, you use that as a structure you use your strategic framework and your, like, a decision-making filter as a structure which supports you in making these real-time strategic decisions at all levels, from, huge strategic decisions down to smaller decisions. And then the last piece of this is that you integrate, and you really go deep into all the different levels of your organization to think about how you can bring this to life and keep it alive in your organization. So I kind of talked through all of these already. So I'm going to quickly, again, you'll get the deck for this. I didn't have anything new to say to that. This is the anatomizing of the decision. The only other piece that I want to say is that typically when you're trying to define your decision-making space, you come up with 3 to 5 dichotomies or tensions that really have bearing on your impact. So one of the tensions might be, it might be staff welfare, wherein the polarity within that is you have need, client need or community need on one hand, and then available resources of time and staff and money. And so you're constantly doing a dance between how do we meet the greatest need with the resources that we have. And so just recognizing that staff welfare and the tension that comes up in that is something that you always want to be attending to in your decision making. Something else might be geography. So are you thinking locally, or are you trying to get to scale? you could be thinking generationally. You could be sort of holding a tension between baby boomers and millennials. In more of a corporate setting, you might have a trade-off that you're constantly navigating between quality versus speed. And it's not, and again, the point is not to define, it's not to make a trade-off. It's like, the fact is that you actually need both of these things. Like, they are interdependent on each other. And it's not about choosing one or the other, but it's about holding these tensions as you're making decisions, so that you're being intentional about the considerations that you use when you're making a decision, and that you're making the decisions accordingly. And so, and that allows you to be making decisions that are more identity decisions than consequence decisions. And then, as I mentioned in the last phase with integration, I touched briefly on the idea that change management is an ongoing state of the world, in my opinion now, and that there are things that you can do to create a holding environment within your organization where you're tending to the hearts and the minds of the organization, and part of the way that you do that is through establishing new mindsets and tending to the culture, and also tending to the structures. So once you're really clear on your intention and what you want to be creating, there's an adage that 98% comes down to the structure, because it's through, you have to be super strong and grounded in your intention, but then creating the structures to support you. Just like if your intention is to lose weight, but you don't get a gym membership and schedule times to go work out with your buddy and do all these and set up times with a trainer, like, it's actually it's much harder to go about reaching that vision if you don't have the structures in place to support it. Okay, so we're going to skip. So I'm going to just say, if you have any questions about creating and implementing a strategic framework, feel free to put those in the chat, and we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. And then lastly, I want to just share with you the idea of all the different layers at which you can be integrating as you want to be thinking about how do you integrate the strategic framework into the organization. So it's like, how do you use it to access the hearts and minds, to care for, nurture the hearts and minds of the people who are working there, to support their behaviors, what agreements can you all make, and then how do your processes and your systems support that, and then ultimately, how does it show up in your culture more broadly. And then the very last idea I'm going to throw at you is the idea of planning, because I've really taken us away from the notion of strategic planning to strategy formation, and then planning still needs to come into it. And so the two main concepts with that are that I recommend a much shorter planning cycle. So instead of trying to do a 3 to 5 year planning, what you do is you engage in much more in-depth annual planning. And you still have these sort of longer term things that you're thinking about, maybe 3, 5, 10 years out, but you are really sensitive to the planning horizon, which means you don't invest a lot of time in trying to flesh out in detail things that are farther down the line. You know that that's the direction that you want to go, but because you can't really see, like, you only want to really plan for the things that you can see in front of the horizon. You know there's things out there on the horizon that are important and that you're orienting toward, but you also don't in depth try to plan them out, because that ends up being a waste of your time and energy and money. All right, so with that, I just want to invite you to think about how you can make the most out of what we've just gone through. And I invite you to chat into the box. What's one thing, just one thing, you're taking away from today? And as you chat that in, I will say that I invite you to keep once you have that one thing that you're taking away from today, I invite you to share it with someone. So think about who in your organization or in your life you want to share this thing that you've learned with, and set up a time with them to do that. And along with, when you do that, when you do share it with them, I encourage you to take an action step as part of the conversation, to say to them, okay, so this is the thing I learned, and this is the one thing that I want to do in relation to that thing. And in sharing that with them, whoever you're sharing it with, you can create support and accountability. And part of the way you do that is by saying, this is the one thing I want to do, and by this date is when I'm going to do it. And then ask them to check in with you to see if you've done that. And then lastly, I want to offer a gift to you well, let's see, I'm actually going to offer this gift to everybody who wants it, is to have a free 30-minute session with me to take some time to digest the waterfall of information that I have just shared with you, to go deeper into your specific strategy needs and to identify steps that you can take to strengthen your strategy and based on what it is that you need. And for the first 5 of you that sign up for this call with me using the link that is on the screen, I have a primer on organizational culture and strategy. It's just a sort of a way of high-level way of thinking and putting those two together that I would love to share with you as a gift for the first 5 of you that are quick enough actors that you're able to go ahead and schedule that session now. And so in doing that, I also want to put the link in the chat box. Oh wait, there's my chat box right there. Here's the link in the chat box as well. So yes, it is a lot to digest, and we are now going to go to questions. And what Lindsay and I talked about ahead of time is that we got started a little late, so we didn't have as much time for questions within the hour as I was hoping, but I can stay on for a little while longer, and I'm happy to share with you or answer questions that you have now. And Lindsay, if you want to call out and see if there's any particular questions that you think we need to address now, please feel free to do that. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see my face again. And if anyone wants to put on their video, I'd love to see you as well. So fun to see faces.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole, so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, I'm so happy, and I apologize again to everyone for that little frustration in the beginning. I did not see any additional content questions that came in, and you did a great job of noticing the clarifying questions as they came up. So I made sure that we kind of covered each one of those. But yes, I definitely encourage anyone, and you can also unmute yourself. So if you want to talk, if you have a mic, or I know there's a couple of call-in listeners, and I don't believe that you have the ability to take yourself off of mute on the phone. But
yes, and I see a couple questions coming in chat, so I'm happy to start talking about those. Okay, so the first, I'm actually going to do the second question first. So Shonda asks, can I speak about how to not shelf the strategic plan? So I guess actually, Shonda, it would be helpful if you could clarify for me, do you mean if you do a strategic plan, how do you not shelf it? Or if you do what I'm talking about, which is the strategic framework, which is different than a strategic plan, but related, how do you integrate that so that the strategic framework itself doesn't go away? And so I will assume that that's what you're asking, and I'm going to just answer that question. Great. Yes. So I believe that actually really, and what I've seen is that it comes down to the structures, and there are an enormous number of ways to take the things that you have, the values and the strategies and the mindsets and everything that you're going to develop as a way through the conversations of building the strategic framework, and integrate that into the culture and the practices of the organization. So I really think it comes down to those two things, is thinking about how do we infuse these concepts and the life that is going to come into our body and our team through these conversations. How do we infuse that into our culture to keep it alive? And then also, how do we integrate it into our structures and our processes? And so one example might be that for the culture piece, you might take one of your values, and you might, on a monthly basis, you might say, this is the value that we're working on this month. And then in staff meetings or you create some little box, and people can put little, I noticed so-and-so embodying this value, or in staff meetings, you recognize people who are embodying the value, or you just talk a lot about that value and what it means, and you figure out ways of recognizing and identifying when people are exemplifying that value. And so that really gets at the cultural piece. And then structurally, one of the things that you can do, there's a lot of things you can do, but some of the things you can do are you can incorporate your strategic framework into your hiring processes. And so you can share it with people as part of the hiring process, get their feedback on it. You can do it during an interview, you can do it ahead of time, and then ask them questions about it during an interview. You could even have them do writing assignments on it ahead of time, so that you're actually, and then that's one of my favorite things, because it actually starts to align your hiring and bring people in that are aligned with this culture that you're creating and you've articulated in a lot of ways through the strategic framework. But then you can also do things like in your performance reviews, orient them to all the different things that you've talked about. So whether you are, if there's different strategies that different folks are working on, can you articulate that in the expectations that you're laying out in performance reviews, and then in the conversations that you're having about performance reviews, how do you keep attention on those? And then also, how can you use the values? How can you align your performance review process with the values that you have? So are you keeping it kind of hierarchical, or is it a much more of a mutual exchange and there's feedback kind of going both ways? And how do you support the skill sets of the staff to be able to have those conversations both ways? And there's like layers upon layers, and it's really amazing what you can do with it. Another way that you can think about it is you can, whenever you're doing any communications effort, you ground it in what you've articulated in the strategic framework. Same thing whether you're doing any grant applications, whether you're seeking funding for anything. Like, there's so many different ways that you can build the concepts into the you can build the concepts into the structures. And another way that, like in staff meetings, you could regularly talk about what strategies are working, what strategies aren't, and just integrating this notion of experimentation and probing, and like, this is what we're trying to achieve over here. What are we learning about that? And using staff meetings in an intentional way to create the time to reflect strategically as a group about what you're working toward and how that's going and what you can learn, is another way of keeping it very alive in the organization. Okay, so that I've talked about that for a while. I'm going to now go on to the other question, which is, how do you prepare a group to have these conversations if the group is wary or doesn't feel empowered? And actually, Abby, would it be possible for you to unmute yourself? Because I have a question that I feel like would help me refine my answer to you, or help me focus my answer to you, if you can unmute yourself. And the question, which I'll ask, and if you can't, you can, you have a mic. You don't have a mic, but you can type. Okay. So the question is essentially, it's really around why the group is wary and why they don't feel empowered. Because often there's good reasons that people are wary and that they don't feel empowered. And it often comes down to leaders and the culture that exists in the organization, and people having a fear of retribution, or having tried in the past to be, having, had the opportunity or tried in the past to be full participants in a process, and then their ideas weren't received, or they felt shut down, or they felt dismissed, and all of that stuff. So I would say that, okay, great, you chatted something in. So, okay, you have a staff that has new leadership, and so I'm assuming that they had challenging experiences before, which is what led them to be wary and not feel empowered. And so that's great, because yes, excellent. So you have the opportunity to establish a new culture, and really, I think it would be really supportive for you to be intentional about that. That's what you're doing. And so part of the way that you do that is you share what your intention is for how you want things to be, and then you build trust over time, and you align your actions with your intention, and you essentially demonstrate that you really are walking your talk. And gradually over time, that trust will build with folks. And so in the interim, yeah, exactly, you're trying to break them out of the old patterns. And so in the interim, part of what you can do is you can, one thing that you might do is that you could invite them to submit something in writing that is anonymous, and if you have some, a consultant working with you, or if that there's ways to make that even feel more safe than others, but you can then aggregate what they have shared and then feed it back to them so that they're able to see that you have heard what they have said and that you are you believe that you are benefiting from their contribution, and figuring out ways. I mean, I think there's tactically a lot of ways that you could do that, but I think the principle that you really want to anchor into is constantly feeding back to them the value of the contribution that they've given to you. And even if the contribution that they've given to you, or the opinion that they've given to you, you end up deciding to do something different, recognizing that you heard what they said, that you really considered it and weighed it and used it as part of your decision making and appreciated it, and then made this other decision, and then sharing the rationale for why, even if you're not going in the direction that they are telling you to go, but just fully honoring them in the process of making the decision, can also build trust. So it doesn't mean you have to do everything that they're saying, and also being able to be really clear from the get-go of who the decision maker is when you're having a certain conversation, and like being really explicit about, I'm incorporating you in this conversation because I want your ideas, but I'm ultimately the one making this decision. Or I'm incorporating you into this conversation because we collectively as a group are making this decision together, and then we're all going to stand behind it. And so helping people know what the expectation is and who holds the power in those dynamics, and then sticking with it is another way to really build trust. Okay, great. And I'm happy to talk about this more with you at some point. So I want to move on to the next question. And if you have any additional questions, Abby, just definitely let me know. Okay, Ada says, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. We have a board with an employee. We have a board with an employee director. We need not only the board to do this exercise, but have the director buy in, since she's the implementer. Suggestions to empower the board. Yes. And actually this, I think, also applies to Abby's question as well. So the other thing is, when you are going to be going into something like this, spending some time to orient people to what it is really valuable. So saying, this is what we're going to be doing. This is why I want us to do it. This is what I think is going to benefit from us. This is how the process is going to be. And actually being really intentional to articulate what it is that you're doing can go a long way. And so with the director, and actually, Ada, can you say what your role is in the organization? You have an employee. You're the chair of the board. Okay, great. Okay, so you, before you do anything, you need to get the director to get on board with this. Like you need to do the work through conversation and through exchange with the director to get them on board, to get them excited, to get them motivated about the potential for this process, to figure out a way that you can do it that is being sensitive to I'm assuming the needs that they have and the current level of responsibility. The amount that they have on their plate is gonna impact their ability to be excited about this. So if they're already feeling really stretched and you're like, hey, come do this thing, then it's gonna just be probably another experience of pressure or overwhelm. But if there's a way to be sensitive to where the director is, and to build, and I would say even first, like, build interest and excitement about the process and the possibility of what you could create and why this would be so useful for the organization and for the director. Like, speak to self-interest. Like, the reason that I want to do this is because I actually want to make your job easier. I want to be able to support you better. I want us as the board to be able to really have your back and to have super alignment around what we're trying to create, so that we can be as effective as possible working together to make this happen. And so, and then get the excitement about the possibility of the idea, and then say, so how do we make this happen? How can I support you in making this happen? What ideas do you have of how we might want to roll this out? And that's how I would go about doing that. Do you have any follow-up questions to that? And I'll wait for you to try to type that in, to chat that in. And if anybody else has any questions, then feel free to pop them in, and otherwise we'll wrap up. So Lindsay, do you want to hop in and kind of wrap things up? And if Ada is able to respond in the chat, then we can just pick back up with that.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Nicole for spending this time and staying on and spending some extra time with us today to kick off our webinar program. This was a wonderful way to start it, and I thank you all for staying. We've had so many people stay on to just listen to the Q&A as well. We are going to send out an email to everybody registered with the recording, the slides. Thank you to Nicole for letting us do that. And I will also have a survey and information about future webinars. But definitely check out our lineup. You can visit us at alumni.smith.edu and go to the careers tab. We have some really exciting ones coming up this semester as well. So thank you all, and a special thanks to Nicole. Yes. Oh, and thank you. Marnie says, this was great. So it was really wonderful. And please make sure if you need the information or the link, I'll add that to the email as well so that they have your offer. Oh, and you sent your email. Perfect.
Yeah, and I just put my email in the chat as well. So if anybody wants to contact me, absolutely please do that. And I don't think I put in my my website either. But if you want to check out my website, it's culturewonk.com, and you can check it out. I just put that in the chat as well. And Ada just chatted in with us to say she'll be with us for 4 more years. We just finished in the building to house our function. We weren't successful. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So Ada, why don't you just reach? Oh, you're trying to establish a groundwork so we can try for a new building project, and there's tension. Yeah, so this is probably a more nuanced conversation than makes sense for us to do right now while other folks are hanging out here. So why don't you reach out to me, and I'd be happy to set up some time, for a free 30 minutes to think this through with you and see what sort of supports I can offer and helping you think through how you might approach that. So, all right, great.
All right.
I think we're going to call it.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again soon.